So imagining Tomorrowlands, using foresight to create strategic narratives. I'm hoping everybody is seeing that slide. This is a companion in many ways to Scott Bolson's lecture. It builds on some of the theory that he laid out for you. The most important part, if you go back and look at that lecture again, the sort of connection between the two of us is where Scott talks about Stewart's the experiential futures ladder. That idea of how do you go from thinking about the future to creating something that represents the future. And the steps in that are you start with setting, you then move to scenario, then you move to a situation. And for Scott, it's then moving to an artifact, creating a thing from the future. For me, and for what we're going to talk about today, it's how do you create a story from the future, something that takes that bigger idea and, as Scott talks about, makes it more human, makes it more immediate for people so that it has more resonance for them. So that's really what this is really all about. And that's what I mean when I talk about a strategic narrative. As a futurist, we have one rule. That is, you cannot predict the future. And any effort to do that is a waste of time. What you can do, though, is if you understand how trends work, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the details, you can begin to think about the shape of possible futures. And if you can think about the shape of possible futures, then there's a chance that you can think about how to navigate those futures to get to the future that you want. The very first tool that is so incredibly important for futurists is something we call the futures cup. Because we can't predict the future, we have to constantly be thinking about the possibility of multiple futures. And they fall into a bunch of different categories. There are the possible futures, which could be everything, including, yes, aliens showing up, or someone coming up with a pill that extends life forever, to the more useful group, which we call the plausible futures, things that have some basis in what we see going on today, some trend, some driver that we suggest might make it actually possible for that to be a future that comes true. But then the one that we're most concerned about is what we call the preferable future. The idea is, what's the best possible future for us, for our organization, for our city, region, nation, whatever it is we're working on, given what we know about what is in that plausible range of futures. So that's what we're going to focus on today, is how do you create a story that sort of brings to life that preferable future in a way that it can be useful for a number of great ways. And there are actually three really important things when we think about how we use these stories. The first one is as a tool for information. If you go back and look at Scott's, his very first example was using sequestered CO2 to light underground spaces. That was a great bit of information, something I had never heard of before. But he put it in that package of those beautiful drawings that came with it, and it made it much easier for me to understand and easier to communicate with other people. So stories, strategic stories about the future are a great tool for information. The second thing is they're a great story purpose for inspiration. And I think this is really important for you guys working on sustainability and sustainable futures. Right now, the biggest problem that the sustainability of the green movement, or whatever you want to call it, has is that we have been so bombarded with, collapse and negative stories and all the worst possible future scenarios that many people have given up, that they're not inspired to actually think that they can make a change. So if you think about a story that's about a better future, one that is reasonable for people, you can help to inspire them. But the third piece, and this is the critical piece that you have to have, is the story also has to be a tool to empower them. It can't just be, oh, we've solved all the problems in the world and everything's wonderful. It has to give us a sense, or at least start a conversation about how is this future possible? What would we have to do to get there? What would have to change? And so that's what you want to keep in mind in terms of why you're actually creating the future stories that you're creating as you move through them. So for me, and this is what I believe more than anything else, is that if you want to change the future, you have to start by changing the stories you tell about the future. What is possible? What do we prefer? And some indication of how we might actually get there. And that's what I'm hopefully going to give you guys some more tools that you can do for your own stories as you move forward. A warning though, it is really easy when you start to think about creating stories for the future to fall into the trap of creating utopias as we try to get rid of all the dystopian, terrible, nasty stories that we've been shouldered with all this time. I like the idea of what's called a practopia. And this came from Heidi and Alvin Toffler, who were two of the first really sort of major mainstream futurists way back in the 1970s. And what they do is they talk about a future that is not perfect, but is measurably better than today. One where you can look at it and compare it to where we are and say, yes, I want to go there because I see how my life would be better, or I see how the life of my community would be better. But we acknowledge that in the future, we will not actually be able to solve all of our problems overnight. They're still going to exist. So that's by way of sort of big theory. And that's as much as I've got for you in terms of the theory. I want to talk about sort of nitty-gritty tactics. How do we actually write a strategic narrative? But the very first one is the one you started on already, and that is identifying your topic area. What area are you interested in investigating? What area is relevant to the group that you're representing? From that, you move to a second step, which is creating a focus question. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and what that means. And that's one of the things we want to hopefully come out of today's class, you be a little closer to that. Then you begin to have to summarize the current situation. What do you know about what's going on in the world today? Then we begin to think about the future. As we research tomorrow, there are two things we're looking for. One we call drivers of change. The second is a technique we call trend scanning, and we'll explore what both of those are as we go through today's workshop. And finally, you begin to create your scenario. And then from scenario, we end up with story. And for the last two steps, that's probably what I'm going to leave for some of the other folks that are coming in to really dig deeper into that. But hopefully, I'm going to get you a little bit closer to being ready to actually create that scenario. Now, to do this today, I'm going to deconstruct one of my own pieces of speculative fiction, a story called Gabby's First Kiss. And I'm going to basically go backwards, right? And I'll be honest with you. Part of this is done for academic reasons because I didn't go through all these steps in a neat way when I wrote the story. You probably won't when you write most of your stories. But it's good to be able to have the organization to sort of think about it. So the first thing is creating that topic area. And for Gabby, I was particularly interested in looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and seeing if there was one that I really wanted to dive into a little bit deeper. And the one I chose was number 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities. A very broad kind of statement, right? How can we make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable? Now that could apply to almost anything in the world, pretty much, when you start to think about that. And it would be really hard to create a story just from that particular topic area. But it then got me interested in the work that I was actually doing by trying to focus it more into something that might give me the ability to empower people. And that's the key, right? How do you find a story that you think is going to resonate with the folks that your audience and the people who actually are going to try to use that story to create some sort of change? And in my case, because at the time I was doing a lot of work in sustainability in Florida, which is where I live, the question for me became, what would a resilient Florida coastal community look like in the year 2035? And as you're thinking about taking your topic and focusing it down, here's what I want you to do. I want you to pick a time horizon, right? Pick some date in the future, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. It doesn't really matter. That's up to you and what you want to use the story for. Try to begin to think about a setting, a place. Where does this story take place? And then be as specific as possible. In other words, we don't want to know what a regenerative future for everyone would look like, but what a regenerative future in Berlin might mean for those people who are professionals or those people who are elderly, for instance. And the more focused and specific you can get, the better off that you actually are. So we've got a sense of what we're trying to explore. Now, how do we begin to explore it? And the very first thing is you have to know about today. You have to start with where you are. So you begin by doing research on the current situation, which all of you that's implicit in some of your focus questions. I'm sure all of you have some ideas about the current situation you're dealing with. But one of the reasons this is so important is if you do much work as a futurist, you discover that the majority of people actually live 5 to 10 years in the past. So the more you know about today, you're actually exposing them to the future in making, which many times they don't even know about. So for instance, for my story with Gabby, what I know about today is that coastal areas in Florida, particularly, are overdeveloped. that the economic incentives that exist encourage that overdevelopment. And for those of you who are not familiar with how that works in the United States, every time a hurricane comes through Florida and knocks everything down, everybody goes out and gets their insurance money, and then they rebuild exactly where they were. So another hurricane come along and knock things down. It's a really stupid situation, but it's one that's been around for many, many years. And then thirdly is that there are governmental issues that are in effect here. And building codes actually do limit some of the innovation that can be done. So think about that, process that as you're going through all of this, and think about some of the current things that you might know about your actual work. And then what I want to do now is move into researching tomorrow. How do we actually begin to find those things that will help us better understand what tomorrow is all about? And I'm going to talk about a couple of different things that all come from the process we call environmental scanning. And all environmental scanning is the idea of just systematically exploring the external environment as far and wide as you possibly can. And some of this is very specific. For instance, those of you who are doing citizens advisory groups, you're going to do a lot of research on what is existing today and what kind of groups are actually out there probably to learn more about that. But the other thing you want to do is to push yourself to just look for things that are elements of the future that at first glance might not be relevant, but might actually some weird kind of way be incorporated. And I know that's a very kind of vague statement, but what that really means is don't just research using those sources that you know are about your topic. Do random research. And most of us do this online these days, but pick a topic that you think might not be particularly related, or better yet, pick a publication that seems to have nothing to do with the topic you're interested in, and scan through it, even just for the headlines, for the titles of different articles. And when you find something that seems completely unrelated, start to try to think about how it might actually have some impact. And I'll give you some examples as we go through this further. So there are two things that we talk about in terms of when we're trying to do this, and that is, we talk about drivers and trends. So I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to talk about drivers to give you an idea of what they're actually all about. They are the mega trends. That's another term a lot of people use for them. Usually there's something that are quantifiable. You can say that in the last 10 years, we've seen X amount of growth or decrease in whatever it is you're talking about. And people are projecting that same kind of growth or decrease or change in a quantifiable term over the next 10, 20, 30 years. They almost always cut across sectors. They're things that are going to affect all of us in our futures, no matter what future we're trying to create. And here are three that I think are most relevant. The first one is aging world. By 2050, the population over 65 will double, and that's globally, right? In some places like Japan, the disconnect between the number of older people and the number of younger people is even greater. But across the globe, we're seeing people live longer. We're seeing them age, in some cases better, so they're more active. In other cases, in the industrialized nations, for instance, like the United States and the EU, we're seeing this as being a huge drain on all of the economic resources. How do we take care of all of these older people? So whatever future you're thinking about, when you project 10, 20, 50, or 100 years into the future, think first about the demographics. What's going to look like there? More people going to be old, or people going to be young? Secondly, of course, is climate chaos, which is what you guys are talking about every day in terms of what's happening. But it is clear that any story about the future has to factor in climate change and what climate change means, both at an economic level, a social level, a political level, across the board. Now, your guys are all sort of focused on that area. But even if you were doing a story that wasn't about climate change, you'd still want it to be a big character in the story you're creating. And finally, thirdly, is the one that I call Welcome to the Digital Age. And we all kind of intuit this, but I'm not sure we completely understand what it means. In 58, the integrated circuit was introduced for the first time. It was a little bitty tiny kind of thing. Nobody was very impressed by it. But today, 70 years later, what has actually happened is 70 years later, it has driven everything in our life. And if you want to understand what that means for the next 20, 30, or 50 years, you need to go back in history. Think about how radical the industrial age was. Think about how radical the introduction of the printing press was to everything about the way we live. That same kind of change, that magnitude of change, is also what's going to be driven by the digital age, which really, truthfully, is just now becoming the way we live, right? We've talked about it being here forever, but it really has taken about 70 years for it to change everything. So ask yourself, what is that? How does that play into the future that you're actually trying to think about in terms of the future? So once again, let me try to apply these just very quickly. What might these drivers impact coastal communities? In the demographics, particularly in a place like Florida, which is already starting to see this, you have more older people retiring to coastal communities. Those people are more at risk from all of those storms. Those people are going to need more help if they're going to have to be safe from those storms, if we're going to create resilient communities. Climate, once again, incredibly relevant to that story because it's what the story is really all about. But as we have more of those hurricanes, you're going to see a greater threat. And finally, well, what's the technology? And so some of the drivers can be positive, and we want to find the positive ones. Technology is really interesting when you think about buildings and how we build homes in the future. We're able to build more resilient buildings using things like nanotechnology, using things like 3D printing. So there are a lot of different things that will actually sort of impact what's going on. So scanning for trends is what futurists spend most of their time doing. And there are lots of different approaches to doing this, but one of the best sort of tools is to think about this acronym STEEP. And what that means is you want to make sure that you're looking for trends that relate to changes in society, technological changes, which of course are the easiest ones to find, the ones we tend to spend too much time on, as Scott reinforced. So don't get hung up on that. Make sure you include them, but not everything. Changes in the environment, both climate change that we talk about and other sorts of environmental changes that might not be human driven, but certainly will have an impact on humanity. Changes in economics, changes in politics. So what I'm going to do is go through and give you just one example of each of those trends that I used in creating my story. So first of all, society. One of the things that's happening in the United States, at least if we think about it as a sort of small trend, we haven't seen it really big yet, but there is this return to multi-generational homes. More people are moving back in with their family. Certainly COVID accelerated that. In this country, it's also being driven by the ridiculously high cost of housing, as that young couples can't afford to buy a house like they used to. And so we're starting to see a shift in this country where people are beginning to think about staying closer to home, living with extended families, and also living with sort of created families in the future. So that was one of the trends in society. Technology, I already sort of talked about this idea of advances in building materials. One of the things, there's a specific example, and that's one of the things you look for in trends. Can you find a specific example to reinforce the larger trend? And this is about a construction company that's trying to figure out how to make homes that are better equipped for hurricanes. And they're actually using 3D printing. And they're able to test those, before they actually release them into the larger marketplace and build homes that are actually designed for the future environmental issues that we're going to be confronting, as opposed to homes that were being built the same way that they were built hundreds of years ago. So that's just one of many possible technologies. The environment. When it comes to the environment, we could spend all of our time, obviously, thinking about this particular trend. But one of the things that I'm really interested in is how we're starting to see embracing natural solutions to climate chaos. And mangrove restoration is an incredibly important movement for coastal regions, places that get hit by very nasty hurricanes and other storms. The mangroves, the natural environment, is actually designed that it is able to take the energy from those storms and not destroy the land behind them, not wipe out all of the little barrier islands. But we, of course, here in the United States and Florida particularly, have torn down all those. So one of the things we're starting to see is, can we rebuild them? Can we do something to help nature in that task? Economics, this is one that, for my story, turns out to be sort of a negative accelerator. In the state of Florida, once again, as I said, the current situation is such that if my house gets blown down by a hurricane, the insurance company pays for me to rebuild it in the same place. That is shifting, and there are already people talking about the fact then in the next 10, 15, 20 years, it will be almost impossible to get homeowners insurance in Florida, the state of Florida. So what that means is that that's going to be a negative leverage. It's going to suggest that people are finally going to be forced to do something differently. Maybe it's build more resiliently. Maybe it's abandon the community that they actually live in. But the end of those bailouts is an important piece in terms of what we're thinking about. So, and finally, politics. And the one from my story that some of you are already familiar with is this idea of community action committees. In the past, most decisions, even at the local level, have been made by governmental institutions that are imposing policy on different communities. One of the things that we're starting to see is this idea of environmental advisory boards, that groups of community members coming together, that what they share in common is living in a certain bioregion, right? And by that sharing, that's the key element in their decision making, as opposed to whether or not they're this political party or that political party, or whether or not they're thinking about the typical leverages that exist. So the next step is to create your scenario. And this is where the futures focus generally ends. Futurists start often with scenarios. But the scenario, think of it as a blueprint. The idea is that you want to incorporate the drivers and the trends. You want to describe that future setting in broad terms, at least. And you think the questions you want to answer is, what are the rules in this future scenario, in this world, or this city, or this region that I'm talking about? What are the opportunities? What's different than it is today? What's the same? And don't ever forget that many things do change the same, even though the future may be radically different. What do people want and not want in this future? So as many of the details that you can actually create for your scenario is what you want to do to create the foundation for your story. Storytellers, fiction writers call this world building. Futurists call this creating a scenario. But it's about rules, it's about engagement, it's about expectations. That's as much of that stuff as you can possibly then get. So, for instance, for Gabby's first kiss, the scenario. We've seen increased climate chaos. The storms have destroyed the communities. There are no bailouts available. The community has to create their own answer, but there are new building technologies that can use smart materials to adapt to storms. So I pulled through the various trends we talked about earlier then and just turned them into thinking about what that would look like. And what really the scenario wants you to do is it wants to create for you the spark of the story. Oh, in this world, in this environment, at this time, with these pressures that exist, what would a character most likely do? What would they need? How would they react? And that's where you start to get the story itself. And I'd love to spend all day talking to you about storytelling, but we don't have time today. But I do want to just remind you that the step from scenario to story is really, for me, where the fun happens. It's where the excitement happens, right? Who are your characters? Really flesh those characters out like any good fiction writer would, and think deeply about their needs, their wants, their desires, their strengths, their weaknesses. Do you have heroes and villains? Do you have a new approach to heroes? Maybe it's about a community working together. But the more detail you can build around those characters, the more lifelike they are, the more spark you will bring to your story. The second thing is plot. And this is one where I'm sometimes a little bit of a disagreement with other people who do this work. I'm not sure that for a strategic narrative, you need a ton of plot in the sense that you need big conflict. We don't have to slay the corporate dragon in every strategic narrative. What we really want to do is create more of a moment, create an environment, create something where people get a sense of what the life might be like. And there'll be some conflict because that's what makes the story interesting, but it doesn't have to be necessarily everything. And to that, on that note, I'll just sort of go back to the Kim Stanley Robinson example that you guys are talking about. Ministry for the Future has big conflict in it. It's also incredibly lectury, but I think a much better example from that author is Pacific Edge, which is from a trilogy that he wrote, I believe, in the 1980s. And in that story, the conflict is very muted. It's, how people get along in this community. What's fascinating is the community, because it's one that's figured out how to deal with the problems of the environment in future California. And so that's an interesting example, if you got the time to look at that one, of a way to create more of a moment and a feeling within the plot, as opposed to we went out and we made all of the fossil fuel companies quit doing what they were doing, which is another approach. You can certainly have that kind of conflict. And finally, then resolution. And resolution in a strategic narrative, when you're thinking about the future and sustainability, is an interesting one, because much of the movement that I'm seeing is toward what we call regenerative futures. And a regenerative future is one where we haven't solved all the problems, but we are continuing to innovate, continuing to make change, continuing to move toward that preferred future. So I'm okay personally with a slightly open-ended version of that ending, of that resolution. We may not have solved all the problems in the story, but we actually may have gotten closer to the solution than we had before. But once again, you're going to get much better advice on how to create stories from other translators. I'm going to leave you with this final thought because it's my favorite image. This is a map from the 1400s. And I think it's just incredibly compelling when you look at it for a moment and think about what it was used for. You know, the map maker knew what was there in the land area, had a pretty good sense of what happened right offshore. But if you go far enough, there be monsters. And if you go too far, you simply drop off the end of the world. This map and maps like this were actually used to convince people to get on tiny ships and to explore the world, to discover the new world, so to speak, to find out that the globe was much larger, much more varied, much more interesting than they had ever thought before. And that's what your stories are trying to do. They don't have to be perfect. They don't have to actually get you the answer that maybe is the answer everyone will come up with. They have to inspire people to start a dialogue, to have a conversation, to think about different approaches to solving some of these problems that exist out there so that we can make a better world, one that works better for everyone. And that's pretty much what I have for today's lecture.